During the attack on the village, a farmer found an orc baby crying beneath the rubble and chose to save him, even knowing it could cost him his life. But minutes later, 3 orc warriors emerged from the smoke, and one of them was the baby's mother. What happened next? Not even he could have imagined. There are 3 kinds of destruction in the world. The first is nature's: hail that flattens crops, floods that swallow fences, frost that kills what took months to grow. This destruction has no face, no intention. You mourn it the way you mourn rain, by bending your shoulders and starting again. The second is time's: the beam that rots from the inside before anyone notices, the memory that fades before it can be kept, the body that gives way without asking permission. This destruction is quiet, and for that reason it hurts differently. The third is the kind made by human hands. That is the only one that leaves a smell. Thomas Hale smelled the smoke before he saw anything. He had risen early, as always, the kind of man for whom the sun beating him out of bed was a personal defeat. He had milked the cow, checked the north fence, set water to boil, a morning like any other on the quiet plains of Ravenbrook. Then the wind shifted, and with it came the smell: burning wood, burning straw, and beneath all of it, something heavier, the smell of heated metal and turned earth. The smell that veterans of war recognized without needing to think. Thomas was not a veteran, but he was a veteran's son, and the body remembered what the eyes had never seen. He dropped the bucket and began to walk. Ravenbrook was not a village that deserved to be destroyed. That thought crossed his mind as he climbed the small hill separating his farm from the village center. Not as philosophy, but as a simple and brutal fact. It was a place of ordinary people, families who passed the land from father to son, the way people pass recipes and scars. Children who grew up knowing the name of every neighbor's animal. Old men who sat in front of the general store and argued about the weather with the gravity of men arguing theology. There was nothing here worth blood, and yet blood had come. When Thomas reached the main road, the fighting was already over. Only its result remained. 3 houses had caught fire, 2 still smouldering. The third fully collapsed onto itself, leaving only a blackened skeleton of beams. The general store had a shattered window. The central trough had been knocked over, the water mixing with mud and ash into a dark slurry that covered the cobblestones. Signs of struggle were everywhere: hoof marks, dried blood, broken arrows embedded in wood, but no bodies. Whoever had fought here had left, carrying their dead or fleeing fast enough to leave no witnesses. Thomas passed the store, past the communal barn, its doors open and its interior ransacked, past the small fountain in the square where children played on summer afternoons. He called out names. No answer. The villagers had fled into the fields at dawn. That was what you did. It was the unspoken agreement of people who lived near caravan routes. When the noise comes, disappear into the wheat and stay quiet. He knew this, and still the silence pressed down on him. All of Ravenbrook could fit within 20 wide strides from end to end, but that morning it felt enormous. It felt empty in a way that made it unrecognizable. Thomas stopped in the middle of the road and stood still for a moment, just breathing, just listening to the crackle of charred wood and the wind that carried ash back down to the ground it had come from. That was when he heard it. Faint, unsteady, a cry. Thomas was the kind of man who did not believe in fortunate coincidences. Life on a farm teaches that with brutal efficiency, you plant, you water, you wait, and still the frost can arrive on the wrong night and take everything. There is no good luck that wasn't built by work. There is no finding that is not the result of someone having looked. So when he heard the cry, he did not stand still, waiting to hear it again. He started walking. The sound was difficult to locate. The smoke scrambled distances, and the westerly wind created a strange echo between the destroyed houses, making the cry seem to come from 2 places at once. Thomas stopped. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. A trick his father had taught him for listening better in a field of tall wheat where sounds multiplied. East. He opened his eyes. He walked toward the third house in the row, the one that had collapsed completely. What remained was a heap of charred beams, split planks, and part of the tile roof that had come down in 3 pieces. The smell here was stronger, burned wood and something damp beneath, perhaps a water barrel that had toppled inside before the fire reached it. That had helped. It had created a small pocket of breathable air and survivable temperature beneath the wreckage. Thomas crouched. He listened. The cry was coming from here. Certainly. He started working. The larger planks were heavy, some as long as he was tall, and charred enough to crumble at the edges when pressed. But the region's timber was dense, slow-grown, and the core was still solid. He removed the first beam by hauling it over his shoulders, throwing it aside, then the second, then 3 smaller boards at once. The crying grew louder, closer. Thomas worked in silence, with the kind of focus that comes not from urgency, but from purpose, the same concentration with which he repaired a fence before a storm arrived, or stitched leather harness by candlelight. Each movement calculated to avoid collapsing what remained of the structure further. He removed a large crossbeam that had fallen diagonally, creating an accidental chamber, and stopped. There it was, small, very small, wrapped in a piece of thick, earth-colored cloth that had been folded carefully around the tiny body, with the clear intention of hiding, protecting, and cushioning all at once. Vivid green skin, pointed ears, delicate, trembling with each sob, 2 tiny lower teeth, white as river stones, emerging timidly from the lower gum. An orc baby. Thomas was still for exactly 1 second, just one, the time needed for the brain to register what the eyes were seeing, for the heart to ask the question the world had trained it to ask, "Is this my problem?" And then the baby looked at him, eyes like amber, wet with crying, blinking slowly in the grey morning light. There was no fear in that gaze. There was only the most honest thing that exists in a living creature, the need to not be alone. Thomas reached out his arms. He lifted the child. He wrapped it in the cloth already covering it, and added a piece of his own shirt, torn from the shoulder in one practical gesture without ceremony. The baby was cold, not in immediate danger, but cold, the kind of cold that a small body cannot endure for long. The baby gripped his index finger, with both hands, firmly, and stopped crying. Thomas looked at that grip for a moment longer than he intended. It was curious, he thought, how such a small gesture could weigh so much. He was about to stand when he heard the footsteps, heavy, steady, more than 1 pair. He looked up slowly. 3 figures emerged from the smoke. There was a language in the body of those who had survived war. Thomas couldn't name it, but he recognized it. He had seen it in his father when men returned from the northern campaigns. It was something in the shoulders, in the way feet met the ground, in the manner the eyes swept a space before allowing the rest of the body to enter it. It was vigilance that had become posture. It was fear that had become muscle. The 3 orc warriors who emerged from the smoke carried that, but they carried something else as well. The one in front was tall, nearly 2 heads above Thomas, who was not a short man. Her skin was deep green, the shade of new leaf after rain, and it contrasted with the dark leather armor, reinforced with metal plates that covered her torso and shoulders. Thick braids fell down her back, decorated with beads of blue-green stone. Turquoise, Thomas recognized, common in the quarries to the south. Her eyes were yellow and fixed, and in them he identified something with precision before anything else. Terror. Not the terror of one who fears dying, the terror of one who fears arriving too late. Behind her to the left came a warrior of broader build, voluminous curly hair partially bound by a leather strap, the rest falling free around her shoulders. She carried a short-handled axe in her right hand, already raised, not aggressive, but ready. Her eyes were not on the baby. They were on Thomas. To the right, the third warrior was the quietest. Long, straight hair with thin braids along the sides, carrying a spear in one hand with the ease of someone carrying an umbrella. She was assessing the space around them, the exits, the debris. Thomas realized she had already calculated at least 3 different attack angles. All 3 stopped 6 paces away. The silence lasted the length of a thunderclap. Thomas did not move, did not retreat, did not advance, made no gesture that could be read as threat or flight, because he knew by instinct or experience that any sudden movement in that moment would be the last wrong move anyone needed to make. The baby still held his finger. The braided warrior, the mother, Thomas was certain now, because her eyes never left the child with an intensity that only exists in one kind of love, took a step forward. Thomas extended his arms, slowly, with open palms. The oldest gesture in the world. "Look, I'm not holding a weapon. I'm holding what is yours." She took the baby, with a gentleness that violently contrasted with everything her body was equipped to do. She took the child from Thomas's arms and held it against her chest, curving her body around it in a gesture that was pure instinct and pure architecture at once. The exact shape a body takes when it wants to say, "This will not be touched while I am standing." The baby protested for a second, and then reached out both hands, 2 small green hands with chubby fingers, toward Thomas, made a sound, not a cry, something different, something that sounded almost like a name. All 3 warriors looked at that, then looked at Thomas. The curly-haired warrior lowered her axe 2 inches. Just 2. But Thomas noticed. The spear carrier took her eyes from the exits and set them on him, not with suspicion, but with something closer to a question. The mother looked at Thomas for a long moment. There was something she wanted to say, and had no words for, or perhaps she had words, but in a language he didn't know, and the space between the 2 languages was too wide to be crossed in seconds. That was when the horses appeared. Still distant, the sound came from the north, muffled by smoke and distance, but unmistakable. Many of them. Fast. Organized. The border hunters were coming back. Thomas didn't think. He pointed. "That way." The finger pointed toward the path between the wheat fields, a shortcut that led behind Matthias's farm, and from there to the low forest to the south. Invisible from the road, invisible from the horses. The curly-haired warrior was already moving. The spear carrier covered the retreat, backing away, eyes still sweeping. The mother looked at Thomas one more time. There was something in that look he couldn't name in that moment. It would take weeks to find the word. Recognition. She nodded once, and disappeared into the golden wheat with the other 2. The horses arrived 3 minutes later. Thomas was alone among the ruins when they passed, just a farmer assessing the damage, which was exactly what he looked like. The hunters looked at him. Thomas looked back, said nothing. They passed. And Thomas stood there a moment longer, his index finger still faintly warm where the baby had held it. The sun was midway through the sky when Thomas returned to the farm. He had spent the morning helping the villagers who were beginning to trickle back from the fields, checking structures, helping clear debris that blocked paths, carrying water to those who needed it. It was what you did, not because anyone asked, but because there was an unwritten agreement in Ravenbrook, as old as the foundations of its houses. When something falls, everyone helps lift it. He said nothing about the warriors, said nothing about the baby. There was an instinct in that omission, not the calculated lie of someone with something to hide, but the prudent silence of someone who understood that certain stories told too early become problems before they become truths. The farm was as he had left it, the cow still in the pasture, the water he had set to boil now cold over the dead fire, the north fence waiting for the repairs the morning had interrupted. Thomas worked until late afternoon without stopping, with the kind of physical determination that also serves as occupation for the mind. But the mind did not cooperate. It kept returning to the same point. The baby that had gripped his finger. There was something in that gesture, so small, so involuntary, that stayed lodged between his ribs in a way he couldn't dislodge. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't worry. It was something more like the feeling of having heard the beginning of a song and never hearing its end. He wondered where they were now, whether they had made it to the forest, whether the hunters had taken another road. Dinner was quiet. Bread, cheese, the last potatoes from the cellar that needed to be used before they turned. Thomas ate slowly, looking out the window at the deepening dark of the field. Ravenbrook was quiet at night. It always had been. The kind of quiet that city people mistook for melancholy, but which the villagers recognized as simply the sound of a place that has nothing left to prove that day. He had almost fallen asleep in the chair when he heard it. Footsteps, heavy but careful. The step of someone trying not to make noise while not yet knowing the ground. Thomas took the lantern before he took anything else. He opened the door. The yellow lamplight reached the figure standing 4 paces from the threshold, the Orc mother, alone. The baby slept against her chest, wrapped in new cloths. She had exchanged Thomas's improvised coverings for her own tribal fabric, thick linen in geometric patterns of red and ochre, but she had kept the piece of Thomas's shirt. It was folded over the child's shoulder like an extra blanket. He had not expected this. From her expression, she had not expected to be here either. There was something different about her now. Not the warrior of 3 attack angles and combat armor, but a woman who had been on her feet for hours after a battle and was beginning to feel the weight of that. The shoulders still carried their usual posture, but there was an exhaustion beneath it she wasn't hiding. Perhaps she had no energy left to hide it. Thomas looked at her. Looked at the baby, asked the question with his eyes before asking it with his mouth. The other 2. She shook her head slightly. They weren't here. They had gone, followed the clan. She had stayed. Thomas needed only a moment to understand what that meant. Not the full reason. That would come gradually, in gestures and silences over the following weeks, but enough. She was alone in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of people. It had to do with the absence of place. The kind of loneliness that cannot be solved with company. She placed a closed fist over her chest. Fingers together, the fist soft. Not the battle gesture, but something more formal, more ancient. Thomas had seen it once in an ethnography book the village priest kept on his shelf, dusty between the psalms, the Orc gesture of recognition, the gesture of someone saying, "I see you, and I name what you did." It was not gratitude. It was more than gratitude. Thomas looked at her for a moment, then pointed to the barn. "You can stay here." She looked at the barn, looked at him, said nothing, but stepped inside. Her name was Vora. Thomas learned that on the 3rd day, when she pointed to herself and said the word with the clarity of someone teaching a language for the first time. He repeated it, mispronounced, the R far too soft where it should have been guttural, and she made a sound he took a moment to recognize as laughter. Brief, almost inaudible but real, the baby was named Darrow, that he learned earlier, on the 2nd day, when Darrow was crawling across the barn floor and Vora called him with that short word, and the child lifted his head as though recognizing not just the name, but the exact way she pronounced it. The first days had a simple structure. Vora stayed in the barn. Thomas left food on the threshold, bread, fresh milk, whatever there was. She ate, he worked. Darrow slept or crawled or watched the world with the amber-eyed gravity of a child who had not yet learned that the world doesn't deserve that much attention. There were no conversations. There was no shared vocabulary sufficient for that. There were gestures, and there was work. It was on the fourth day that Thomas arrived at the barn in the morning to find the door open, the hay reorganized, and the water buckets already full. A task that took 40 minutes and that he had planned to do before breakfast. Vora was standing beside the well, drying her hands on her clothing. She looked at him. He looked at the buckets. She lifted one shoulder slightly. The universal gesture for it was nothing. I was already awake. Thomas nodded. The next day she was in the fields before him. Strong in a way that was difficult to describe without sounding like exaggeration. Not the strength of effort, but the strength of structure, of a body built for heavy work, the way a good hoe is built for soil. With balance, with density, with the right intention in the right place. What took Thomas 2 shifts, Vora did in 1, without hurry, without display, with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. Darrow stayed in a makeshift basket in the shade while she worked. Thomas had placed an old blanket at the bottom of the basket and a linen screen over the opening, protection from insects. Vora had looked at this when she arrived in the morning, and there was a brief pause before she placed Darrow inside, and Thomas understood that the pause was her registering the gesture, cataloguing it. On the late afternoon of the 5th day, they were sitting in the shade of the barn, resting, and Thomas looked at Darrow sleeping in the basket and said without thinking, "He's strong." Vora looked at her son, then looked at Thomas. "Darrow," she said. "Darrow," he repeated, this time with the right pronunciation. She nodded. There was something in that nod that was more than confirmation of pronunciation. A week and a half after the night of the lantern, the two had developed a functional language, half real words learned haltingly, half gestures that had acquired fixed meanings through repetition. 2 open palms meant, "Do you need help?" 1 finger pointing to the sky in the afternoon meant rain tomorrow. Darrow, with his arms stretched toward Thomas, meant what it had always meant. The child wanted the farmer. Thomas was at first uneasy with this, not because Darrow bothered him. On the contrary, there was something incredibly simple and uncomplicated in the way a small child decided who it liked, without filter, without history, without the complicated reasons adults invented for the same choices. But he was conscious of what Vora had lost. Darrow's father had died in the attack. Thomas had come to understand this gradually, not through a single account, but through a series of signals that accumulated. The way Vora sometimes stopped mid-task and stared at a point in the field that held nothing but horizon. The way she placed her hand on the leather strap on her left wrist, a simple adornment, nothing special, but one she touched sometimes as though checking it was still there. The way she looked at Darrow when he slept, with a love that carried within it also the shadow of a loss that had not yet finished revealing itself. One night, Thomas lay awake thinking about this, not as a problem to be solved, simply as something that needed to be carried carefully. The way you carry a basket of eggs on a cobblestone road, Ravenbrook was small enough that one man's secret belonged to everyone before the end of the week. Thomas had said nothing, but there were other ways to tell a story. The thread of green wool caught on the south field fence, carried by the wind, but caught by the keen eye of Marta Colwyn, who passed there every day with her sheep and had the visual memory of a cartographer. The footprint in the mud near the communal well, too large to belong to any villager, proportioned in a way that was not quite human. The sound of work in Thomas's field, when, by the calculation of someone who had passed on the road at the wrong time, Thomas was clearly on the other side of the property. Within 4 days, Ravenbrook knew, not the details, but enough. Thomas was at Aldrich's store buying salt when the first words came, not with anger, but with that village curiosity that has the texture of a lantern and the intent of a fishhook. "Heard you have company, Thomas," said Aldrich without looking up from behind the counter. "I have seasonal workers like everyone else." "No, it's not the right season." Thomas bought his salt and left. The next day it was paid to the blacksmith, who stopped him on the road under the pretense of asking about a gate order and used the last 2 minutes of the conversation for the real subject. "They say it's an orc." "Who says?" "Marta saw something on the fence." "Marta sees ghosts in wall stains." Peda laughed, a short laugh, of a man who recognizes when a conversation has been closed elegantly. But the village continued. The jokes began at the tavern, where things always begin, not malicious jokes, but the kind that use humor as cautious approach, like a child touching an unfamiliar dog with a fingertip before deciding whether to get closer. "Careful, Thomas. You'll end up with a green family." "B," said Rolf, the tavern keeper, one evening when Thomas had come in for a mug before bed. There was laughter. Thomas drank his mug slowly. "Could be worse," he said. More laughter, this time uncertain about how to interpret that. Thomas left before they had to decide. What the village didn't know, what came to them in fragments over the following weeks, like light through shutters, was the rest. That Vora had repaired the barn roof alone one afternoon while Thomas was in town, using construction technique no local carpenter knew, leaving the structure more solid than it had been in 10 years. That when Thomas's calf became trapped in the mud of the north field after a night of rain, it was the animal's cries that woke her, and she had freed the calf and treated the cut on its leg before Thomas arrived. That when Darrow crawled along the village cobblestones on mornings when Vora passed to fetch water, because she had begun using the communal well in the early mornings, before most people rose, the children who appeared early with their mothers stared with the inevitable attraction that children have for other children, and Darrow received them with open arms and a smile that showed his 2 white teeth. The children were the first to yield. They always are. Then came the wolf incident. A lone wolf had come down from the northern hill, thin, probably sick, the kind that became dangerous, not through strength but through desperation. It appeared at the edge of the village one afternoon, when a group of children was playing near the Whitmore farm fence. Vora was 50 meters away. The wolf saw the children. The wolf never came close to them. No villager had seen what happened. Only the result, the wolf retreating into the forest. The children without a scratch, and Vora standing between them and the field, the spear leaning against the fence on the outside, with Darrow on her hip, and her breathing only slightly quickened. The mother of one of the children came running, stopped, looked at Vora. Vora nodded once, turned, and walked away. The village sat with that for a few days, chewing on it, processing it. Prejudice doesn't end all at once. It loosens gradually, in fits, like a poorly braided rope that gives one thread at a time before coming apart. Thomas watched it happen, and waited. The night the hunters returned was a moonless night. Thomas had learned, through years of farming, to pay attention to moonless nights, not out of superstition, but out of practical logic. Dark nights are the nights when animals move differently, when strangers arrive by the path that doesn't pass lit windows. There was something in the air that night, not the smell of smoke this time. Something subtler, the wrong sound of distant horses, the way the village dogs went quiet instead of barking, the silence of an animal that recognizes something larger than itself. Thomas had not yet slept when the knock came. 3 knocks, steady, the kind that doesn't ask permission. He opened the door. 4 men, horses behind them, with torches. The border hunters wore no formal uniform. They wore the improvisation of men who made their own bearing the badge. Heavy leather, travel-worn, the kind of face that hardens after years of sun and decisions that admit no questioning. The one in front was older. He had a scar on his jaw, and the eyes of a man who had learned to read people the way a merchant reads accounts, quickly and without sentiment. "We know you're sheltering an orc, farmer." Thomas stood in the doorway. "Good opening. I didn't come to talk." "I know." Thomas leaned against the frame. "But you'll have to talk anyway, because I'm not going anywhere and you're not coming through this door." The scarred man assessed that. "She's a combatant. She was with the group that hit the road. She's a mother with an infant. That doesn't erase what she did before." What she did before. Thomas tilted his head. "Flea-armed men who were hunting her caravan, protect her child from the rubble of a house that you helped destroy?" The man stepped forward. Thomas didn't step back. "I can do this the easy way or the hard way, farmer." "There are other ways," said a voice. It wasn't Thomas. It was Aldrich, the store owner, standing 10 meters away with a lantern. The hunters turned. There were more people. Peter the blacksmith, arms crossed, with the expression of a man who hadn't left home at midnight for entertainment. The entire Whitmore family, father, mother, 2 older children. Old Marta, who had seen the footprint in the mud and had decided, apparently, that what mattered was not what the footprint was, but whom it was protecting. The priest, without his formal vestment, coat over his sleeping clothes and glasses askew, then more and more. Thomas had seen them arriving from the corner of his eye and had stayed quiet, not from surprise, but because there was something in that moment that deserved not to be interrupted. The village had not planned this. There had been no meeting, no discussion, no vote. There had been only the collective instinct of a small place that had spent weeks watching and had decided, each one separately, the same thing. The scarred man looked at the crowd, looked at Thomas. "You're protecting a monster." "We're protecting a neighbor," said Peter, in the flat voice of a man with no interest in debate. Silence. The 4 hunters looked at one another. There was a simple arithmetic in that moment. The arithmetic of someone calculating what an action will cost and realizing the price has risen beyond their budget. The scarred man stood still for a long second, then mounted. The others followed. They took the north road without another word. Thomas stood in the doorway until the hoofbeats disappeared into the dark. Then he turned to the villagers. There were many things that could have been said in that moment. He said none of them, simply nodded, and the village nodded back, and went home to sleep. Prejudice doesn't end in a single night. Thomas knew that. There was a difference between the people who had stood in front of that door and the people who had made jokes at the tavern weeks before. And the difference was not that they were different people. It was that they were the same people, and that something had changed between that moment and this one. There was no good word for what had changed. Testimony, perhaps. There are things that only change when you see them with your own eyes. Not what someone told you, not what you inherited from generations who never encountered what they feared, but what your own eyes registered, without second-hand filter. Ravenbrook had seen Vora in the field at 5 in the morning, when frost still covered the grass, carrying twice what any human worker would carry, without complaint and without stopping. Had seen Darrow crawling along the stone walkway with open arms for the human children who had learned that this green child was simply a child, and there was no other conclusion possible from that point. Had seen the wolf. Had seen the barn roof, which the village carpenter had examined with professional curiosity and declared with some grudging admiration to be technically superior to what anyone around here would do. Fear yields when it meets enough evidence. Not all at once, thread by thread, but it yields. In the weeks that followed the night of the hunters, things changed in small steps that were only visible in hindsight. Aldrich's daughter began leaving a little extra from the day's bread on the store windowsill. Covered with a cloth, without a word, without announcement, without turning it into a larger gesture than it was. The Whitmore family invited Vora to help with the harvest, paid work, with the formality of a commercial transaction that was at the same time the closest thing to a welcome that Ravenbrook knew how to offer. The children stopped at the fence when Darrow was outside and stayed there for hours, passing sticks and stones through the gaps between the rails with the intensity of people conducting the world's most important work. Vora learned the human language slowly, with the precision of someone learning out of necessity rather than curiosity. The practical words first: tools, weather, numbers, names. The harder words after. There were moments of frustration, moments when the gesture wasn't enough and the word didn't come, and she stood there with the expression of someone containing the impulse to abandon everything. And Thomas learned to stay quiet in those moments, to not fill the silence, to let her reach the word in her own time. A ritual had established itself without anyone proposing it. In the afternoons, when the heavy work was done, and Darrow had been fed and was in his drowsy state, Vora would sit on the back porch and look out at the fields. Thomas was sometimes there as well, sometimes not. When he was, there was rarely conversation, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had reached a point where the silence of two people who trust each other has a different quality than the silence of two people with nothing to say. One of those days, she spoke slowly, choosing each word. In Orc, when someone saves a child of the clan, they become Vethkara. Thomas waited. There is no human word, she continued. It means that the clan recognizes you carry something of the clan, not by blood, by choice. Thomas sat with that. Sounds like responsibility, he said after a while. Vora looked at him. Sounds like family, she said. Summer arrived the way it always arrived on the plains of Ravenbrook, not suddenly, but like a tide, first warming the ground that had been cold for months, then the days, then the nights, until one day you noticed it had been weeks since you'd needed a second shirt at dawn. Darrow had grown, not the slow, almost imperceptible growth of human children, which you only notice when clothes no longer fit. Orc growth was more candid, more direct, as everything about orcs seemed to be. The baby who had gripped Thomas's finger among the ruins now crawled with enough speed to require eyes in all directions at once, and had recently discovered that it was possible to stand for increasingly longer periods if there was something to hold on to. The fence, Thomas's leg, the patient tale of the old dog that had been Thomas's since puppyhood and had adopted Darrow with the quiet dignity of an animal that knows exactly what it is doing. That summer evening, Thomas was on the porch. He had eaten early, potatoes with the lamb that the Whitmores had given as part of the payment for the week's harvest work, and Vora had prepared something with the herbs she grew in a corner of the field, herbs Thomas didn't know by name, and which had names in Orc that he was still learning to pronounce, and the result had been something that combined both ingredients in a way that was neither one cuisine nor the other, but a third new thing entirely. He had thought about that while eating, the way two distinct things could create something that was neither of them. The night was clear, a crescent moon, enough to see the fields without a lantern, and above it the sky with all the stars that an interior without light pollution allowed you to see. The kind of sky the city never shows, that only exists when you are far enough from everything to have nothing between you and the universe. Vora came through the back door with Darrow on her shoulder. The baby was in that half-asleep state, the condition small children occupy before fully surrendering to sleep, when they are still conscious enough to observe but too tired to act. The amber eyes were cataloguing the sky with the gravity of someone recording important information. Vora sat on the bench beside Thomas, said nothing. Thomas said nothing either. For a few minutes there was only the sound of crickets and the low wind in the fields, and Darrow making the small irregular sound of a child fighting sleep and losing. Then Darrow reached out his arms toward Thomas. Vora looked at the baby, looked at Thomas. Thomas extended his arms, and she passed Darrow to him with the natural gesture of someone who is not making a concession, but simply acknowledging what is true. The child settled against Thomas's chest with the efficiency of someone who knows the terrain well, and slept. Thomas looked at the sky. He had wanted many things throughout his life. The practical and reasonable things a plainsman wants: a good harvest, a farm that doesn't need constant repair, enough health to keep working, the company of people worth keeping company with. He hadn't known he also wanted this nameless thing, this person beside him, this child in his arms, this silence that was not empty. Ravenbrook was quiet around them. The fields stretched out dark and full, ready for another harvest. Somewhere in the village, a human child laughed at something, the kind of midnight laugh that sounds like a happy accident. Vora turned her face slightly to the side, looked at Darrow sleeping, looked at Thomas. There was something in that look that was difficult to name, not because it was complex, but because it was simple in a way that language is always slightly too large for, like trying to carry water in a net. Thomas thought of the word it had taken him weeks to find: recognition. Vethkara, she said quietly, not as information, as affirmation. Thomas nodded. Darrow slept. The sky continued vast and full of ancient light, and on that small farm on the plains, where a village had learned that what you choose matters more than what you inherit, summer kept arriving the way tides arrive, unhurried, without ceremony, without needing permission.